In a poor southern town, a 14-year-old black boy unexpectedly comes across a white billionaire collapsed in the dirt after a venomous snake bite. This was the very man who once seized land with cruelty and drove the boy's family into ruin. Every reason tells him to turn away. Yet he chooses to save the man. No one could have imagined that this single act of mercy would ignite a turning point that would change the entire town forever. Luke's muscles screamed as the bike chain snapped with a sharp ping, leaving him and Frank Miller stranded a quarter-mile from town. Frank's weight had been crushing his shoulders for the past hour. The man's expensive suit now soaked with blood and sweat that attracted flies in the September heat. "Please," Frank whispered against Luke's back, his voice barely audible. "Don't let me die." Luke's hands trembled on the useless handlebars. This was Frank Miller, the man who'd bought half of Millbrook for pennies on the dollar, who'd forced Luke's family deeper into poverty with every property he acquired. Luke's mother was working 16-hour days now, her tips barely covering their rent since Miller's project had driven away so many customers. Every rational thought in Luke's head screamed at him to leave this man here to die. Frank Miller had shown them no mercy. Why should Luke show him any? But as Frank's breathing grew more labored, Luke heard his father's voice as clearly as if Samuel Carter was standing right beside him. His father, who'd carried wounded soldiers through Vietnamese jungles without asking if they were good men or bad men. His father, who'd come home from war to work construction jobs that barely paid enough to survive, but who'd never complained about life's unfairness. "Son," Samuel had told him countless times, "the day you decide who deserves help and who doesn't, that's the day you stop being the man I raised you to be. Character ain't tested when it's easy. It's tested when every fiber of your being wants to do wrong." Luke closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that teaching settle on his 14-year-old shoulders like a coat too heavy for him to carry. He thought about his mother's words that morning. "Baby, I know you're angry about what's happening to our town, but anger that turns you into somebody you don't recognize ain't worth holding on to." With a deep breath that tasted of dust and desperation, Luke slid off the bicycle seat. Frank's body was heavier than he'd expected, the man's expensive cologne now mixed with the metallic smell of fear and venom. Luke's thin arms shook as he began the slow process of dragging Frank down the red dirt road, one agonizing step at a time. His shoulders burned, his legs trembled. Sweat dripped into his eyes, making them sting. But with each labored step, Luke felt something settling in his chest. Not satisfaction or righteousness, but a quiet certainty that he was choosing to remain. The person his father had raised him to be, regardless of whether Frank Miller deserved it. "Why?" Frank mumbled, half-conscious. "After what I did to your family?" Luke didn't answer. The truth was too complicated for words. He wasn't saving Frank because the man deserved it. He was saving him because Luke Carter deserved to remain someone who could sleep at night, someone who chose mercy, even when mercy felt impossible. The sun beat down mercilessly as Luke dragged Frank another 50 yards. His back ached. His hands were raw from gripping Frank's jacket, and doubt crept into his mind like poison. What if Frank died anyway? What if Luke exhausted himself for nothing? What if people thought he was a fool for helping the man who destroyed their community? But then he remembered the last conversation he'd had with his father before the construction. Accident took Samuel's life. They'd been sitting on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink when a neighbor had come by asking for help with his broken fence. "I don't much like that man," Samuel had admitted after helping anyway. "He's got a mean streak and he don't treat his wife right. But you know what, son? I didn't help him because he deserved it. I helped him because that's who I am. And when you know who you are, other people's character can't change yours." Those words echoed in Luke's mind as Mrs. Jenkins spotted them from her yard and came running to help. Together, they managed to get Frank through Dr. Morrison's clinic doors, just as the old doctor was finishing his afternoon rounds. "Copperhead bite," Luke gasped, collapsing against the clinic wall. "Found him by Cotton Creek about an hour ago." "Doctor." Morrison took one look at Frank's gray pallor and swollen leg, then began barking orders to Mrs. Jenkins. As they carried Frank inside, Luke remained on the clinic steps, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of what he'd just done. He'd saved the life of the man destroying his town. He'd chosen grace over justice, mercy over revenge. And sitting there in the late afternoon heat, watching his own hands shake from exhaustion, Luke realized that this moment would define him for the rest of his life. Not because of what Frank Miller might become, but because of who Luke Carter had chosen to remain. His father would be proud. His mother would understand. And for a 14-year-old boy carrying the weight of his family's uncertain future, that was enough to know he'd made the right choice, even if the world never thanked him for it. 3 days later, Luke still hadn't left Frank Miller's bedside. Dr. Morrison had moved a chair into the room specifically for him, understanding without words that this vigil was about more than medical necessity. Luke sat there through the long hours of Frank's unconsciousness, working on homework while listening to the steady beep of machines monitoring the life he'd fought so hard to save. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, but Luke had grown accustomed to it. He'd grown accustomed to watching Frank's chest rise and fall, to checking the bandages around his swollen leg, to the way the businessman's face looked smaller and more human without the arrogant confidence that had defined him during his previous visits to Millbrook. Luke's mother brought meals from the diner, lukewarm soup and day-old bread that she couldn't afford to give away, but did anyway. She never asked why her son insisted on staying. Martha Carter understood her boy well enough to know that this wasn't about Frank Miller at all. This was about Luke proving to himself that he could live up to the values his father had instilled in him, even when those values demanded impossible sacrifices. Through the clinic walls, Luke could hear fragments of conversations that painted a picture of his community's continued suffering. Mrs. Rodriguez crying on the phone about her children's struggles in their new school. Mr. Washington discussing the foreclosure auction of his family's farm equipment. Each voice was a reminder of the destruction Frank Miller had brought to their town, and Luke found himself wrestling with complicated emotions that seemed too large for his 14-year-old heart to contain. On Tuesday evening, as Luke was dozing in his chair after another long day of waiting, Frank's eyes fluttered open for the first time since Dr. Morrison had pumped him full of antivenin. The businessman looked around the small room with confusion, his gaze finally settling on Luke's face with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been shame. "You stayed," Frank said, his voice raspy from days of unconsciousness. Luke sat down the algebra homework he'd been struggling with and studied the man who'd caused his family so much pain. Frank looked vulnerable in his hospital gown, smaller somehow than the confident figure who'd stepped out of that black limousine. But Luke reminded himself that appearance could be deceiving. A wounded snake was still dangerous. "Somebody had to watch over you?" Luke said simply. "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "After everything I've done to this place, to your family, why would you care whether I lived or died?" Luke considered the question, trying to find words for feelings he didn't fully understand himself. The truth was that somewhere during these 3 days of watching over Frank, his anger had transformed into something more complicated. Not forgiveness. That would take much longer. But a recognition that the man lying in this bed was more than just the sum of his destructive actions. "My mama works double shifts now because of what you did," Luke said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Our rent's past due. Half my friends' families have had to move away. You know what she told me when I said I wanted to stay here and watch you?" Frank shook his head weakly. She said, "Baby, that man nearly killed our town. But if we let him die on our watch, what does that make us?" Luke leaned back in his chair, feeling older than his years. "So here I am, Frank closed his eyes, and Luke could see tears leaking from the corners. It was the first real emotion Luke had seen from the man, and it surprised him. Throughout all of Frank's business dealings in Millbrook, he'd maintained a cold professionalism that suggested he saw people as nothing more than obstacles to profit. But this vulnerability was different, raw and human in a way that made Luke's chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. "I destroyed everything," Frank whispered, his voice broken. "I came here seeing dollar signs and development opportunities, and I turned real people's lives into collateral damage." "Yeah," Luke said, his matter-of-fact tone carrying more weight than any accusation could have. "You did." The simple acknowledgement seemed to hit Frank harder than anger would have. He turned his face toward the wall, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that spoke of a man finally confronting the true cost of his choices. Luke watched this display of remorse with mixed feelings. Part of him felt satisfaction at seeing Frank's pain. It seemed like justice after months of watching his community suffer. But another part of him, the part shaped by his father's teachings about mercy and grace, felt something that might have been pity for a man who'd clearly lost his way and was only now beginning to understand what he'd sacrificed in pursuit of profit. "Mr. Miller," Luke said softly, waiting until Frank looked at him again. "My daddy used to say that anybody could be decent when it was easy. He said the real test of a person was what they did when they had every reason to be cruel." Frank studied Luke's face with an intensity that made the boy uncomfortable. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was the best man I ever knew," Luke replied, his voice carrying a quiet pride that spoke of deep love and loss. "He died 2 years ago in a construction accident, working a job that barely paid enough to keep us afloat. But he never let hardship turn him mean." "I'm sorry for your loss," Frank said, and Luke could hear genuine sympathy in his voice. "Thank you." Luke pulled out his homework again, signaling that the conversation was over for now. "You should rest. Dr. Morrison says you're not out of the woods yet." As Frank drifted back towards sleep, Luke found himself thinking about the complexity of human nature, how the same man who'd callously destroyed families could also show genuine remorse, how mercy could coexist with justice, and how his father's teachings about character were proving more complicated in practice than they'd seemed in theory. He'd chosen to save Frank Miller's life, and now he was watching that choice ripple outward in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The question that would haunt him in the days to come was whether he'd saved a man capable of redemption or simply preserved a force of destruction for another day. Frank Miller's hands shook as he dialed his Chicago office, the phone feeling impossibly heavy as he prepared to dismantle 25 years of ruthless ambition. Through the clinic window, he watched Luke carefully organizing medical supplies with the same methodical precision the boy brought to everything else, a reminder of the values Frank had abandoned somewhere along his climb to wealth and power. The conversation with Jennifer lasted 18 minutes and ended with her hanging up in frustrated disbelief. Frank sat holding the dead phone, processing what he'd just done. In less than 20 minutes, he'd potentially destroyed his company, his reputation, and the financial empire he'd built through decades of treating people as expendable resources. The strange thing was that instead of panic, he felt relief. The first genuine relief he'd experienced in years. Frank's transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. It had begun 3 days earlier, watching Luke maintain his vigil with the quiet determination of someone fulfilling a sacred duty. The boy's presence had forced Frank to confront questions he'd spent his adult life avoiding. What kind of man destroys communities for profit? What kind of person sleeps peacefully while families lose their homes to feed his bank account? But the real breaking point had come during a phone conversation he'd overheard between Luke and his mother. The boy had been explaining why he couldn't come home for dinner, his voice tired but resolute. "Mama," I know we need me to work extra hours at the store, but I gave my word to watch over him. Daddy always said a man's word was all he really owned. Frank had pretended to be asleep, but Luke's words had hit him like physical blows. Here was a 14-year-old boy sacrificing his family's financial stability to honor a commitment to someone who'd shown them nothing but cruelty. The contrast between Luke's character and his own had been so stark that Frank had felt physically ill. Luke appeared in the doorway, now carrying soup from the diner and wearing the serious expression that had become familiar over their days together. The boy had aged visibly during this ordeal, the weight of adult responsibilities settling on his young shoulders in ways that made Frank's chest tight with guilt. "Heard you making phone calls," Luke said, setting the soup on the bedside table, with careful attention. "Sounded important?" Frank studied the boy's face, searching for judgment or satisfaction, but finding only patient curiosity. "I canceled the demolition, told them to halt the entire project." Luke's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his composed facade that Frank had seen. "That's going to cost you everything, isn't it?" "Probably." Frank's voice was steadier than he'd expected. "The board will likely fire me. Investors are threatening lawsuits. I'll probably lose the company, my reputation, everything I've worked for." Then why do it? It was the question Frank had been asking himself for days, and the answer was both simple and impossibly complex. Because a boy taught me that some things matter more than money. Because I finally understand that I've been measuring success by all the wrong standards. Luke sat down in his familiar chair, his expression thoughtful. "Daddy used to say that money was just a tool. He said the important thing was what you built with it and who you became while you were building." Frank felt tears threatening. Again. Another new experience for a man who'd trained himself to see emotion as weakness. "I built nothing worth having, Luke. Worse than that, I destroyed things that could never be replaced." "So what are you going to do now?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither fully understood. Frank looked at Luke, this remarkable boy who'd shown him mercy when mercy seemed impossible, and felt the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders. "I don't know," Frank admitted. "I've never been in this position before. Never had to. Start over. Never had to earn forgiveness. Never had to prove I was worth the grace someone had shown me." Luke was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his mind with the careful consideration he brought to all important matters. "Mr. Miller, do you remember what you were like before you became rich?" The question caught Frank off guard. He thought back to his childhood in a small town not unlike Millbrook, a place where people knew each other's names and troubles, where neighbors helped neighbors without expecting payment, where his mother had taught him to say please and thank you, and to treat everyone with basic human dignity. "I was different then," Frank said slowly. "Smaller maybe, but cleaner somehow. I cared about things that mattered." What happened to that person? Frank closed his eyes, remembering the gradual erosion of his values, how each compromise had seemed reasonable in isolation, how success had become an addiction that demanded increasingly high costs, how he'd learned to see people as either useful or expendable. "I lost him somewhere along the way," Frank said. "Traded him for things that turned out not to matter at all." Luke nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "Well, maybe that's who you need to find again. Maybe that's what starting over really means." As evening approached and Luke prepared to finally go home for dinner with his mother, Frank found himself thinking about identity and redemption and the possibility that it wasn't too late to become someone worth the faith this remarkable boy had placed in him. The future was terrifying in its uncertainty, but for the first time since he'd awakened in this clinic bed, Frank Miller felt like he was moving towards something worth having instead of just accumulating things he didn't need. 2 weeks after, nearly dying in a field outside Millbrook, Frank Miller signed away his fortune with hands that remained surprisingly steady. William Hartley, his lawyer from Chicago, watched the proceedings with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a spectacular act of self-destruction. "$1 million," William said for the third time that morning, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in Dr. Morrison's humble clinic. "You understand that once these documents are signed, there's no going back. You'll be essentially homeless." Frank looked up from the papers scattered across the clinic's small desk, his gaze finding Luke through the window. The boy was teaching a group of younger children how to repair a bicycle chain, his patience infinite as he guided small hands through the delicate process. Luke's own clothes were worn and patched, his shoes held together with tape, yet he gave freely of his time and knowledge without expecting anything in return. "Maybe homeless is exactly what I need to be," Frank said, signing another transfer document. The legal proceedings took most of the day. Phone calls to banks and government offices. Each conversation another step in the systematic dismantling of everything Frank had spent his adult life building. Luke sat quietly in the corner, throughout it all working on homework but occasionally glancing up when William's objections became particularly heated. Frank found himself drawing strength from the boy's presence. Over the past 2 weeks, Luke had become his moral compass, a living reminder of what real character looked like. The boy's daily visits had revealed depths of wisdom that seemed impossible for someone so young. Insights about forgiveness and duty, and the difference between justice and mercy that had slowly reshaped Frank's understanding of what it meant to be a decent human being. "This is financial suicide," William muttered as Frank signed the dissolution papers for Miller Development Corporation. "The board will crucify you. Your reputation will be destroyed. You'll never work in development again." "Good," Frank said, simply. Maybe the development industry needs one less person willing to destroy communities for profit. By afternoon, Frank officially owned nothing beyond the clothes on his back and a medical bill he couldn't afford to pay. The transformation was complete from millionaire to pauper in the span of 6 hours. But as he watched William pack his briefcase with the efficiency of someone eager to distance himself from a client's complete breakdown, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Luke approached after the lawyer left, carrying a plate of food from the diner and wearing the gentle expression that had become Frank's anchor over their days together. "Mama sent this," Luke said, setting the plate down carefully. "Figured you might not have much appetite after all that legal business. But she says you need to keep your strength up." "Thank you." Frank accepted the food gratefully, touched by the continued kindness from a family he'd nearly destroyed. "Luke, can I ask you something?" The boy settled into his familiar chair, nodding. "When you made the decision to save my life, did you know it would lead to all this? The vigil, the conversations, watching me try to become someone worth saving?" Luke considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "No, sir. When I found you in that field, I just knew I couldn't leave a person to die no matter what they'd done. Everything else, that just happened because you turned out to be different than I expected." "Different how?" "Well, when you first came to town, you seemed like somebody who thought he was better than everyone else. Like we were all just obstacles to whatever you wanted." Luke's voice was matter-of-fact without accusation. "But these past weeks, watching you struggle with what you'd done, seeing you give up everything to try to make it right, I guess I realized you were just lost, not evil." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I was lost, Luke. I'd been lost for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to know where I was going. And now?" Frank looked around the small clinic room that had become his temporary home, then out the window at the town he'd nearly destroyed, but was now trying to help heal. "Now I think I'm starting to find my way. It's terrifying, giving up everything I thought defined me. But it's also freeing somehow." Luke smiled. that transforming expression that had become Frank's favorite sight in the world. Daddy used to say that sometimes you had to get completely lost before you could find your way home. Your father was a wise man. He was, and he'd have liked you, Mr. Miller. The person you're becoming, I mean. As evening approached and Luke prepared to go home to his mother, Frank found himself thinking about the strange mercy of a boy who'd seen potential for goodness in someone who'd given him every reason to expect the worst. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, figuring out where to live, how to survive without income, how to earn the forgiveness of a community he'd nearly destroyed. But tonight, sitting in this simple room with nothing to his name but the respect of a remarkable 14-year-old boy, Frank Miller felt like the richest man in the world. The fellowship hall of Millbrook Baptist Church had never held attention quite like this. Frank Miller stood at the front of the room facing 43 people whose lives he'd systematically disrupted, holding a manila folder that contained his last chance at redemption. The weight of their collective gaze was heavier than any boardroom presentation he'd ever given. Luke sat in the front row beside his mother, his presence both comforting and challenging, a reminder of the standards Frank was trying to live up to, and the forgiveness he still wasn't sure he deserved. Martha Carter's face was unreadable, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she studied the man her son had chosen to save. "I asked to speak to you today," Frank began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. "Because I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an accounting." Mrs. Rodriguez stood up immediately, her face flushed with months of suppressed anger. "An accounting? Mr. Miller, you destroyed our lives for profit. My children had to leave their friends, their school, everything they knew. What kind of accounting makes that right?" Frank met her gaze without flinching, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. "No accounting can make that right, Mrs. Rodriguez. What I did to your family, to all your families, can't be undone with words or gestures, but I can try to stop making things worse." He opened the manila folder with hands that trembled slightly, pulling out a stack of legal documents. "These are the property deeds to every piece of land I purchased in Millbrook. I'm giving them back to you free and clear." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath. Mayor Henderson leaned forward in his seat, his face pale with shock. Several people began whispering to each other in tones of disbelief. "What's the catch?" Mr. Patterson's voice cut through the murmur, sharp with suspicion earned through years of broken promises. "Men like you don't give away millions without expecting something back." "No catch," Frank said simply, looking directly at Luke for strength. "I'm doing this because a 14-year-old boy taught me something about character that 50 years of living hadn't managed to impart. Luke Carter had every reason to leave me to die in that field. Instead, he chose mercy. He showed me what real strength looks like." Frank began walking through the room, personally handing each family their property deed. Mrs. Rodriguez stared at hers as if it might disappear, tears streaming down her face as the reality sank in that her children could come home. Mr. Washington clutched his farm deed to his chest, his 68-year-old hands shaking as he held the paper that represented 3 generations of his family's work. But not everyone was ready for reconciliation. Mr. Patterson stood up abruptly and threw his deed on the floor, his face red with anger that had been building for months. "This is guilt money," he said loudly. "Some rich man's crisis of conscience doesn't undo the damage. My wife had a heart attack from the stress of losing our home. Your piece of paper won't bring back her health." Frank bent down and picked up the deed, setting it gently on a nearby table. The action cost him more than Mr. Patterson could know. Not in pride, but in the recognition that some wounds cut too deep for any gesture to heal. "You're right," Frank said quietly. "This doesn't undo anything. Some of you will never forgive me and you'd be justified. I'm not doing this to buy your forgiveness. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do regardless of how it's received." "Luke." stood up then, his young voice cutting through the tension with the clarity that only children possessed when speaking difficult truths. "Mr. Patterson, I understand why you're angry. We all do. But my mama's getting her job back at the diner now that folks are coming home. Miss Rodriguez's kids can return to their friends. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's something." Martha Carter rose beside her son, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak for her community through years of quiet service and sacrifice. "This boy saved a man's life when he had every reason to let him die. Maybe we owe it to Luke to see if that man learned something from the saving." Frank looked around the room at faces reflecting the full spectrum of human emotion: anger, hope, suspicion, tentative forgiveness. This wasn't the unanimous reconciliation of fairy tales. This was the messy, complicated reality of real forgiveness, earned one relationship at a time. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Frank said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But if you'll let me, I'd like to earn my place here. Not as the man who took everything away, but as someone learning what it means to be a neighbor." Mrs. Rodriguez approached him after the meeting, her deed clutched in both hands. "My children can really come home." "Yes, ma'am," Frank replied. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of deception. "This doesn't make us even Mr. Miller, but it's a start." 6 months later, Frank Miller lived in a 2-room apartment above Henderson's Hardware, working construction jobs and slowly rebuilding his understanding of what constituted a meaningful life. Some families had welcomed him cautiously. Others still crossed the street when they saw him coming. He was learning that redemption wasn't a destination, but a daily choice to do better than the day before. Luke still stopped by regularly, usually, when Frank was repairing someone's fence or painting a porch for whatever they could afford to pay. They'd work in comfortable silence, two people who'd saved each other in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or cents. It wasn't the life Frank had planned, but it was the life he'd learned to want. And when Martha Carter nodded to him after church, not warmly but without hostility, Frank Miller felt something he'd never experienced in 50 years of accumulating wealth: the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was exactly where he belonged.